So there's my slides. I asked Dolly
All right.
to give a rendition for Dean Radin as a quantum mind. And so that's what Dolly came up with. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, but there you go. There's Dolly. So this is based on a paper that's going to come out soon. It's actually not out yet, but it's available at the moment. It's coming out next month. And I put a link to it here, this tiny Earl Q-brain mind. So quantum aspects of the mind-brain relationship, a hypothesis with supporting evidence. My co-author is Stu Kaufman, who's quite well known, I think, in complexity theory, who was at the Santa Fe Institute for a long time, has written a number of well-regarded books and lots of articles. The idea of a quantum mind is not new. There's a whole website based on this, Quantum Mind. I have the link down here on the bottom. So this was done by Simon Raggett for many years. I believe he passed away. But the website is still there. It has quite a good literature review about the notion of a quantum mind. You have both quantum mind, quantum theories of consciousness. It's not exactly the same, but it's somewhat close. One of the things he says in his review is interesting. On the basis of quantum mind concepts, one should be prepared to envision uncommon and even utterly strange manifestations of quantum entanglement. Certain transpersonal human experience should not be seen as potentially explained by quantum mechanics, but rather required. So I'm going to go into that a little bit later. So our idea here was said by Heisenberg back in 1958, that the quantum state concerns potentia, ghost-like, between an idea and a reality, and that res potentia, the potentials, and res extensia, physical world, are linked by measurement. He was not the first to say this, nor the last. Von Neumann, of course, talked about this, as did Henry Stapp. One of the best popular books I've seen written about this is Quantum Enigma by Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner. There's a long history on this notion that there's something peculiar about consciousness because it's non-physical, which is involved in some way in turning quantum potentials into classical actuals. The interesting thing about this is that we're proposing that the possibles, the res potentia, are ontologically real, and that they do not obey Aristotle's law of the excluded middle. Whereas ontologically real actuals do obey the law of the excluded middle. So an example here then is Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat is simultaneously alive and dead, is not allowed by Aristotle. But Schrodinger's cat is possibly alive and possibly dead. That's okay. So when we talk about mind and matter, we're saying that mind acausally mediates the actualization of potentia. So this mind-matter interaction is not due to physical causes, or what Aristotle would have called efficient cause. It's acausal. If the mind-body system is partially quantum in any form, then certain kinds of non-local subjective experiences should be viewed as physically plausible. For example, the mind would have the capacity to extend beyond the brain and perceive objects that are distant in space or time, and mentally observing certain kinds of distant physical systems would influence the behavior of those systems. Both of those should be physically plausible if part of the mind-brain system is partially operating in a quantum form. If the mind-body relationship was completely accounted for by classical physics, then subjective experiences like telepathy and clairvoyance would be impossible. And you see this reflected in people like Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate physicist, who said, if there were anything to psychic phenomena, that would really be the discovery of the century. In fact, it would be more than that. It would overturn all the centuries of work since the birth of modern science. This is similar to what Arno was saying before, that the objection to things like psychic phenomena is the assumption that we'd have to throw all the textbooks away and start over again. And of course, that's not the way that science works. So it's a little surprising that Steven Weinberg thought that. So Grumpy Cat is saying, well, Stephen, not if quantum mind exists. which I think it probably does. So the folks who have been probably most commonly associated with the idea of quantum processes in the brain are Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, and of course their notion of microtubules as the way that this might be happening. But within parapsychology, this has been discussed at least since 1956. There are actually some articles even before that. So this is part of a whole seminar that was based on the idea of what was known about quantum mechanics already in the 1950s was very clearly seen as overlapping with psychic types of phenomena. So 20 years later, there was another proceedings held, a conference where participants included Gerald Feinberg, a Nobel laureate, and a well-known other physicist, Olivier Costa de Beauregard, and many others, talking about what is the connection between quantum mechanics and parapsychological phenomena. So now we jump 60 years later from that to new scientists talking about a quantum brain. This is 2015. And then 66 years later, we find, and this is an article published in the website Big Link, which I have down here at the bottom. Maybe the brain doesn't operate in classical form after all. And so what this is referring to is an article that was published. By the way, this is November of this year. It's referring to an article that was published a year before in October, Experimental Indications of Non-Classical Brain Functions. And what they did is they mentioned that there are proton spins of fluid, mainly water type fluid in our brains, which can be measured with MRIs. They say that they found MRI signals that resemble heartbeat evoked potentials, which you can certainly see with an EEG, but you can't see in an MRI, at least not normally. So their claim was that they believed that they could only observe these heartbeat evoked potentials because the nuclear proton spins in the brain were entangled. So I have to admit, I've read this article and I sort of understand parts of it, but I don't completely understand it because I don't know enough about how MRIs work and how you could detect entangled systems then using an MRI, but that's what the article is about. Another person who's been promoting the idea of quantum effects in the brain is Robert Lanza. This is his last of a trio of books talking about this notion. And then we have one of the objections, a long-term objection to this notion that there could be quantum effects is that the brain's too hot, it's too wet, it can't sustain quantum coherence long enough. And so Matthew Fisher came along, this is 2015, saying, well, maybe not, that there are certain molecules in the brain which can protect the neural qubits, as he calls them, on very long timescales. So I read this article too, and again, I sort of understand it. Fortunately, there's a popular version of this in Quanta magazine. And again, the link's down there at the bottom. And what this is saying is that these, a notion of these particular spins that has to do with phosphorus ions could exist for hours or even days, in which case the notion of quantum coherence sustaining in the brain is not just at the femtosecond or faster level, but perhaps for very, very long periods of time. And in addition, it's not a single shot. The brain is dynamic, in which case these long-lasting quantum effects could potentially last for weeks or even longer, like permanently, as long as the brain is working. So then we have, a few years ago, quantum nature of consciousness double slit diffraction experiment in medicine. And so what they're saying is that the act of observing mentally through a state of focused attention causes wave function collapse in a double slit diffraction system. So to test the idea, they took 26 participants, took part in a study, divided them into both looking at physical aspects of the double slit interference pattern and also physiological aspects. And they report significant quantum entanglement between the brain and an external double slit quantum system and a whole bunch of other stuff too. You can find this article by just looking up the title. So here's one of the ways that I've been looking at this now. So if you imagine that we want to look at some butterflies, well, the butterflies, there are photons bouncing off of the butterflies. So here's a wave packet, call it A. And then here's another physical system, a photodetector, and then there's a counter, and then there's the eye, and there's the brain. All of these are physical systems, but nevertheless, we end up seeing butterflies. So if you look at this from a quantum mechanical perspective, you can have a matrix, which describes the nature of the photon in quantum mechanical terms. You have a photodiode, you have a counter, you have the eye, you have a brain. These are all just more and more complicated matrices. And if you wanted to describe the interaction between the photon and the photodiode, you take the tensor product. You have another complicated matrix, and then a more complicated matrix and more complicated and so on. It remains a system of quantum potentials at this point. It never collapses into our seeing a butterfly. So how does that happen? Well, John Bell was worried about this, as many people in quantum mechanics were. It's the quantum measurement problem. How do you get from classical actuals into quantum potentials? And he actually drew this sketch showing there's some chain going on here that has to be broken by something, and you can't break it just using physical systems. So there's the chain. So von Neumann is probably one of the better known people promoting this idea that the measurement chain ends only when knowledge of the measurement is registered by what he called an extra physical factor, which meant something like consciousness, subjective awareness. So that gives rise to the idea of an experiment that's something like this, that we know that if you don't know anything about which path information, you end up with a wave-like structure, and if you do know which path information, you don't. So what if you are able to attend mentally to what's going on here? Well, this is yet now very recently, again, last October, saying that physical collapse theories have been promoted for a long time as a way of figuring out how do you get from quantum potentials to classical actuals. But now it looks like this is not working so good, because if it's not a physical collapse, then maybe von Neumann was right. And so what they're referring to here is this large-scale study done by all of these authors as part of the Majorana demonstrator. And to skip over all of the technical details, the bottom line was this, that the continuous spontaneous localization model, which is talking about physical causes of wave function collapse, predicts the existence of a detectable radiation signature in the X-ray domain, and they found no evidence of such radiation. So there's inkling now that's saying that any form of physical collapse is simply not going to do it. In which case, you need something else. So again, maybe von Neumann was right. So here's how we've been testing this in the lab. So we take a laser. Our original form of this was a helium neon gas laser, a couple of neutral density filters to cut down the illumination, and then a double slit, and then a line camera that would measure the double slit interference pattern. And then we got meditators and others to mentally imagine that they could get which path information from the double slit. And if they can get it, even to a tiny extent, any kind of information, then that would presumably change the interference pattern because it would be collapsing it. And it would collapse to the extent to which you got information. So if somebody was not very good at clairvoyance, you may not see anything. If they're really good at clairvoyance, you might see a complete collapse. That was the idea of this experiment. So there's the original system. There's the helium neon tube sticking out of the rest of the apparatus. And I'm working on the double slit, and there's our line camera in the back. So this whole thing is put inside this sealed, with this box outside, a 1/4 inch painted flat black on the inside, and then sealed. So you can't see anything with your eye. You have to do it purely mentally. You're using your mind's eye. And that's not the only experiment of this type. What I just showed you was number 4, but there's a whole bunch of experiments. There's at least 11 experiments that I found that use interference patterns. This one in 1982 used a Fabry-Perot interference system, optical interference. Like Ibison and Stan Jeffers used a double slit system. This one here, I used a Michelson interferometer, and all of the rest of these use double slit systems. If you add up all of them that just use the double slit, there are 30 reported experiments, of which 14 produced a significant result at the 0.05 level. So you would expect somewhere between 1 and maybe 2 to be significant, and 14 were significant. So it's important to understand at this point that most of these studies were experimental in the sense that they weren't pre-registered, they weren't formal confirmation studies, they were attempts to see whether anything interesting is going on. Nevertheless, you still get 14. Of the ones that did have formal tests, meaning that the methods that were used were then replicated later using exactly the same methods and ending up with interesting results. So far, 3 of these studies were able to confirm through replications that what was seen before apparently was able to replicate significantly. So this is, even though the first studies are back in the 1980s, very few of these have actually been done, and most of them are pretty recent. So what are the implications of all this? Well, the main one is that it looks like the brain-mind system has non-local properties. Perception and probably action are not limited by space and time. Well, what else do we call that? We call that all of the classical psychic phenomena, which the point of the paper that we wrote was to make a plausibility case that these kinds of phenomena look to be very anomalous. But the anomalous nature of them comes about because of the assumption that everything that we know about the brain can only work through classical means. And if that is not true, and there's some elements that are quantum, then all of this stuff suddenly becomes plausible. And so if you go to a statistician and you ask, well, what about all the rest of the data? Because there's over 140 years of data suggesting that these effects are real. So Jessica Utts was the president of the American Statistical Association in 2016. She said as part of her presidential address that the data in support of precognition and other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. So if quantum mind is a real thing, what I would expect to happen is that somebody will do a new experiment, they'll find that something like telepathy is real, and then if we're really lucky, somebody will notice that there's 140 years of prior research which is supporting that idea. If we're not lucky, no one will know that. And so they'll say, we made a new discovery for the first time in human history that there's something like telepathy is real, which is only possible if they ignore the past century research. In 2018, Etzel Kardinia at Lund University in Sweden did a review of 11 meta-analyses of different classes of experiments in this realm. His conclusion was that the evidence for psi, short for psychic phenomena, is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines, very similar to what Jessica Utts and many other people have said, that from an evidential perspective, there's basically no question that psychic phenomena are real. The thing that we're waiting for is a plausible explanation. A physical explanation would be best, but maybe there's another approach. I mean, you could take a position of a philosophical idealist or a dual aspect monist or other positions. But I think it would be easier to transition this field from the fringe of science into the mainstream by saying, no, actually there is a physical reason for why we have these experiences. It's just quantum mechanical, it's not classical. So the evidence is clear. Why is this considered controversial? Because of outdated assumptions about what's going on in the brain and the mind. So now, we have a few minutes left, so we should keep calm. It's question time. So I'll stop the...
Thanks so much, Dean. Awesome, as always. You can ask your questions in the chat or by raising your hand. So fire away. And we'll just have Dean keep an eye out.
Clairvoyant reality. Oops, there's a long one.
All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, I'll ask one. Dean, if you could do any experiment in the world, if money and resource access and whatever else, politics was absolutely no, limit, what would you do?
Well, if I had to do an experiment, I would encourage others to replicate the double slit experiment. What my colleagues say, and I'm probably right, that this may not actually have anything to do with the consciousness collapse interpretation. It may simply be another form of psychokinetic influence of something, of a physical system, because we don't really know how that works. And so maybe it's changing the interference system, maybe it's interfering with the photons in the laser beam, maybe. There's a lot of possible effects. But this kind of experiment is so well understood, or at least known within mainstream physics, that it provides a link from physics into this domain. Whereas many of the previous experiments use things like random number generators, and then people get stuck because they have no idea. They can't even think about how you could change randomness in that, and with the only possible exception being a mental manipulation of the Born rule, because that's all about probabilities. It's still, that's kind of a stretch, even for physicists. So using a double slit system, which is exquisitely sensitive to all kinds of physical effects, opens a lot of doorways for some kind of mental influence to take effect. So I did recently get a grant, and so I'm going to start working on it in a couple of weeks, to create a small optical system, which will not be a double slit, it'll be based on diffraction, which I can make out of a tiny little format, and with very sensitive components using Arduino and a microprocessor and a simpler method of doing the analysis as well. Because when you're actually using a double slit system, you have an interference pattern, and the requirement for the analysis is not easy, which is one of the reasons perhaps that people are not doing this. Whereas if you use a diffraction system, you essentially end up with 2 dots of light. And the ratio of illumination of the 2 dots is the equivalent of changes in the interference pattern. So I'm going to make these things. I have enough money to make 50 of these, and I'll distribute it to colleagues around the world to encourage the idea of lots of replications. The other thing is that if I was not required to do an experiment, but I had infinite amounts of money, what I would do is actually not do an experiment, but I would endow multiple chairs of either consciousness studies or parapsychological studies or some combination of both to encourage this kind of idea to be embedded within the academic system. And the reason is that while there's 140 years of research in this domain, at any given time, there's perhaps 100 people who are qualified scientists or scholars who are doing these kinds of studies, and that you simply can't make fast progress. We have made progress because the evidence to date is pretty good, but to make fast and better progress, you need thousands of people. So the example I have here then is at the University of Edinburgh, 1985, accepted a bequeathment from the author Arthur Koestler to create the Kessler Unit of Parapsychology within the psychology department at the University of Edinburgh. And from that one chair, there's something like 100 PhDs now who have gone through that program. So the UK is the world center in terms of the number of doctorate level people who know about this field, because I'm more or less continually shocked by encountering people who read one of my books or somebody else's book and said, I had no idea that this research had ever taken place, because you never hear about it in the academic world. Well, I would change that by endowing lots of chairs. And so you probably couldn't do this at Stanford and Harvard and those places because their endowments are so large they could care less. But there are lots of other schools which, if you said, I will give you $10 million to endow this chair with a research fund, they would jump for joy. And so you start at maybe 2nd or 3rd tier universities, and you saturate the world with it. I mean, if I have infinite funds. If I don't have infinite funds, I chop them into $10 million pieces and do it that way. And one of the reasons I think this would work is not only it would produce a lot of graduate students who actually know something about the domain, but that it would reduce the taboo. It would simply have people able to seriously discuss this stuff without feeling that the universe is going to explode, or or worse, that we have to throw away the textbooks and start over again. So the way that I try to alleviate my more conservative colleagues about that we don't have to do that is by simply saying that we will probably find out that materialism as a philosophy is extremely effective, but it's a special case. It doesn't account for everything, in which case we need to embrace more comprehensive philosophies, where so all the textbooks are still perfectly fine, but they're seen now as being inside this special case. Well, what's not accounted for by materialism very well, which is part of the idea of this conference, is consciousness. Well, where does this subjective awareness come from? The notion that is coming from a classical brain, it seems less and less plausible. And that, I mean, 30 years ago, how many conferences on consciousness were there? 2? by mind-body philosophers? Well, right. Things are changing. So that's what I would do with infinite funds. And actually, I don't need infinite funds. If somebody had a spare 20 million, 40 million, you could do a lot with that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Let's do a check. And there's one question for you there in chat, if you can see it. Looks like on remote viewing.
The remote viewing been used on itself. Yeah, so there are people who are using things like remote viewing to try to advance the state of science in general, targeting different kinds of things like viruses and so on. I don't know that it's been used to try to figure out why itself works. I don't know anyone who's tried that, but on the other hand, there are a lot of people working at different levels with remote viewing because it's gone out of the laboratory and is now more or less a social phenomenon. So I can't keep up with all of that. And I assume somebody somewhere, I hope, has asked that question. And can you use psi for winning the lottery, endow the research? I don't know about the lottery, but people have used a form of remote viewing for investments, financial investments, and there's pretty good evidence that it works. So if you take something like futures trading, where more or less your guess is going to be around 50% right, you can get up to about 60%. So there's a big fat book out on this process now called associative remote viewing, which reviews in great gory detail all of the studies that have been done, and it shows it's not easy. Takes a lot of effort to come up with these financial guesses, but they do work. You actually can make money doing this. And of course, and we don't really know yet exactly why it works. And that's one of the reasons why it's not more effective than it is.
Right. Okay, 2 minutes, and there's another question or two in there. So I'd say take a crack at them. Huh?
Are there limits to the training?
One more.
Yeah. And what is the role of natural talent? So it is very likely that we're dealing with something like a sports talent or talent for playing chess. Talent is very largely a genetic basis. So we've been doing studies. We did a pilot study looking at the genetics of psychics who come from families who have psychics in them. So there's both nature and nurture supporting this idea. And we did find in a very small scale study by taking the full genome that there appear to be differences. We found the difference not in coding DNA, but in the intron sequence. So I think at this point, the more that we look, we probably will find differences in brain structure and in the underlying genetics that would account for the talent. So one of the many other things that I do is I'm co-founder and chairman of a genetic engineering company. We're targeting on psychiatric problems, but one of the things we can do is if we actually do find that there are certain genes, we can turn them up and we can turn them down. And so if we get to that point, by the way, here's another use for $10 million. You need to really figure out what's going on here. You use next generation sequencing and RNA-seq and other methods to find out really like what are the genes or the epigenes that are involved in this. And now we have ways of non-invasively manipulating them in the brain. So we could do that. We could temporarily give you an RNA edit and see whether or not your psychic ability is improved. We could probably do the opposite. We could take somebody who has uncontrolled telepathy, which is driving them crazy and would probably be considered schizophrenic, and tune it down to kind of turn the noise off in their head. So methods for doing this now are available through the methods like CRISPR and other techniques. And we developed a non-invasive way of doing the edits. So it's possible.